Welcome back to Finding the Edge podcast. I'm Robert Fry, joined with Garrett Boyum.
And today we have a great episode for you that we recorded a while back at the end of the spring season. And so we're super excited to finally get this out to you guys. In today's podcast, we reflected on our previous conversation with Ted Monnich about flow and how an ecological approach applies to flow states. And that got us talking about affordances and cognitions and how cognitions kind of play into our perceptions and whether or not we need to process information in order to be able to interact and to perform at the highest levels. Is that really necessary? And what's an ecological approach to that? And then we wrapped up the conversation talking about the power of narratives and how you can use that to build culture, present data, and introduce new practice activities. And so we're super excited to finally get this out to you guys. Robert, anything else to add?
Aside from utilizing storytelling to better explain your data points, I think that's a big key that we talk about in today's podcast. So,
also, we have an announcement, an old announcement, but it's still a brand new announcement that Robert has to share with everybody. So stay tuned for that in the episode.
Oh, yes. That reminds me. Yes, stay tuned for that.
You'll hear it first here on Finding the Edge. So hope you guys enjoy today's podcast.
Let's begin. Analyzing. Finding the edge.
But it has been a while though. It's been
a whole season.
It's pretty much been a whole season since we posted something.
I'm trying to remember what was our last episode. I think it might have been Flow. Yeah, it was Flow. That was a good episode.
Holy cow. That was a good episode. Now more podcasts are talking about flow states now.
Which ones have you been listening to that you've heard them talking about flow?
There was one. It was the Patrick Jones podcast.
Really?
Yep. I think that was their most. It was the most recent episode. They were talking about flow states. It is a riveting topic,
dude. It is.
And I think just the primer is the thing I find so interesting is you don't know that you're in a flow state, because if you do know, then you're not in a flow state.
Yeah. And I think the thing that I like the most about it is that I think that it plays really well with an ecological approach. Mm-hmm. Like when you're in a flow state, you are connecting to the information at the highest level possible. Like the reciprocal relationship there is probably at its peak, because you know how they describe the ability to feel like you're one with the environment. To me, that's kind of like the pinnacle of what you're searching for, or what an ecological approach is about.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I was so interested in it, from the standpoint of when you're in flow, you can pick up a lot more information, and everything kind of seems to slow down a little bit in some ways. Like you have time dilation. Mm-hmm. And to the way that things are, like what you're able to pick up and what you're able to perceive, like, oh, hey, I should do this or that. To me, it's all about then you're perceiving affordances as to, oh, this has an opportunity for action, or I can interact with this. And you're essentially able to perceive more than you would normally be able to perceive under regular circumstances.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And the thing with that, in terms of those affordances, like you mentioned, that flow can come. I feel like it also is kind of like being misconstrued with kind of like in the zone or locked in. When we talk about affordances specifically, because there still has to be that element where you're still kind of, I don't want to say fundamentally aware, but in a mindset that you can still, think about those affordances.
See, one of the interesting things, and this is where I kind of sit on the fence, is how much are we thinking when we are at our peak performance? And especially from an ecological perspective, there's this sense that we are acting more intuitively, meaning we don't need to. The big thing that I think I want people to at least understand from an ecological perspective, that you actually perceive information directly and you don't need to process it. And I guess that's where I think the struggle is that there's this, all or nothing, like you're either thinking or you're not, you're processing or you're not. But I do think there are thoughts, because within an ecological approach, we talk about cognitions, and cognitions in a way are thoughts. But I don't think they are running the show. I think they are supplementing what is going on. And to me, thoughts are more of an emergent property of the athlete environment interaction.
Yeah. And yeah, like you said, I kind of agree with you in the sense that it really isn't an all or nothing approach. I feel like you aren't thinking a lot, but you aren't thinking at all. There's still some element of thought to whatever you do, even when you are in a flow state.
Yeah, I would say more that thoughts just occur.
Right.
If that makes sense. But I wanted to back up to what we were talking about with affordances, because with it, when we're talking about affordances, we're talking about perception. And by perception, I think there should be a conversation about like, what is perception? Because I think a lot of people think that perception is just what you see visually and just your vision. But perception goes beyond that. It's all of your sensing systems. So vision is just one of those things. And so when we're talking about affordances, we're talking about being able to perceive those affordances, being able to detect and pick those up. And they in a way, they kind of exist in the environment, and through being able to pick up information, we begin to perceive affordances. And so affordances, in my mind, are stacked on top of information. So as we begin to pick up information, we perceive things about our environment, and then what do they afford us, essentially. And so in the context of hitting, as we are perceiving the pitcher, we can maybe pick up like, whether it's going to be a ball or a strike, or maybe where the arm slot is. Actually, that would probably be a better one. We begin to perceive where the arm slot might be, and then that informs where we're going to search for the release point. And then as the ball is coming and we're getting information about the ball and the ball flight, then we can perceive what that ball and that pitch affords us based upon our own movement. Because we have to, and so it's trying to look at the entire picture of like, what are we perceiving? We're not just perceiving the information about the ball, but we're also perceiving information about our own body and how it is moving in relationship to that ball.
Yeah. And so, and like another way to think of it, as you mentioned, like kind of like ball release is, in terms of affordances, what kind of visual information is the batter looking at? Now, is the batter looking at the pitcher's arm directly? Is he looking at his lower half? Those are kind of some other questions that you want to answer and hopefully be able to analyze in some way, shape, or form. And there is ways to analyze it.
But I wouldn't say, like, I want to at least clarify, when it comes to affordances, we're talking about opportunities for action. So when we're thinking about that, we're talking about, like, for example, as the ball is coming in that I was giving before, as the ball is coming in, do I have the opportunity or the option still to hit the ball to the pull side? Or based upon how I am moving, do I have the opportunity, only have the opportunity to hit it oppo or to fall it off? And so that's where, when we, I'll like, and maybe retweet, training on the edges and, ugly swings where they're successful. Those are examples of the batter perceiving that pitch was a good pitch to swing at. And being able to, when we're talking about affordances, that was an opportunity for action that the hitter saw, liked, and accepted and acted upon. Whereas maybe there's a pitch, let's just say a fastball down the middle that they took. That pitch and what it afforded, it didn't invite for them in that moment hitability. So a lot of the literature on affordances talks about, does this, if we're talking about like in some of the research looking at like, well, is this stair climbable? Like if we change the height of the stair, does the person perceive that it has the ability to be stepped upon? And so in the same way, as things change, the hitter similarly is assessing, is this pitch hittable in a way? And that's going to be based upon how they are moving in relationship to the pitcher and to the ball. So it's always about, with like, one of the things that is unique about an ecological approach is that it's very much concerned about how the relationship between the athlete and the thing that it's trying, and what it's trying to interact with, or the athlete and the environment. So whenever we're talking about a hitter, we're talking about how the athlete or how the hitter is moving in relationship to the pitcher and the ball.
Okay. Yeah. And so, yeah, that's a lot of, good information there, Garrett. And, hopefully the listeners can pick up on that information. And again, like you said, it's more or less on how the athlete is able to perceive that information and is how they're able to handle it. Like you said, as the ball approaches closer and closer to the plate, the batter is not necessarily like asking himself directly, but kind of intuitively thinking, what does this pitch allow me to do? Does this pitch still allow me to, like you said, go pull side, go oppo, or other options like, does this pitch allow me to, or give me the opportunity not to swing at it, so I'm one ball closer to getting a walk, or things along those lines.
Well, and I think here's a good question to kind of frame this a little bit more. What is one of the biggest things, or one of the hardest things about hitting in general?
Like in terms of hitting a round bat with a round ball?
Yeah. Like what is it that, like, for example, I just saw an article more recently, like talking about like how long does a hitter have to decide whether or not to swing? Right. So if we're very constrained in terms of the amount of time we have to be able to swing, and oftentimes that it's so small that we barely have any time to think, that's where, to me, the thinking part of it is too slow. And so the more that we can cut that part out and perceive things as directly as possible, the better we're going to be, if that makes sense.
No, it makes sense. It makes sense in terms of like how we can, because you only are given when it leads to something like constraints, you're only given so much time to be able to react to the pitch, whether or not to make a swing, etc. So you want to be able to, with the information available, be able to cut out kind of part of that where you can have more time to have those other decisions, I should say.
I could just go in circles about trying to figure out how to best explain this. Because I think that's one of the challenges with trying to communicate these ideas is it's so different from how we traditionally think about things. So to me, I'm thinking about it from the standpoint, how do we perceive things, and then how do we act upon the things that we perceive? And do we need to think about them? Like how much do you, like, when you're doing something throughout a day, are you like, I think a lot of us do this now, but like, as we start going about our day, how often are we like thinking, should I do this or should I do that? Versus like, we just do things.
I see what you're saying. So it's very, very rare in the case where, I'm saying like, oh, I'm just going to start doing things. Because I'm more or less asking, should I do this or this when trying to plan out the rest of my day or go through the rest of my day.
But I'm trying to think of like, when you're playing like a first person shooter, are you thinking right or left? Like, do I go right? Do I go left? I mean, there's levels of, where to, and this is where I think this is a good analogy. Where to look for the enemies, so to speak, based upon your previous experience. Like, okay, he might be over here. I need to pay attention over here. And some of it just becomes instinctual. Like, the timing of things, like you have a sense and a feel of that. And that's kind of where I'm going on this. Like, there's definitely an element of thinking, but I don't know. That's where I'm kind of curious your thoughts. I don't know what kind of video games you play.
Oh, not a whole lot, but a big, avid, probably my favorite game of all time, Call of Duty Black Ops 2, which is a first-person shooter game. So it goes right into what you were mentioning.
I guess that's my question is like, how much decision making are you making? Like, the only time, like maybe in your weapon selection and, what type of class or whatever.
Well, I feel like, but the other thing too is, and this will go great, is, what kind of environment are we in? Mm-hmm. Too, because we're not, if it's my decision making, I feel like is less constructive when I'm doing something like team deathmatch or free for all, because it's just, find the enemies. But if it's something like search and destroy or capture the flag, like there's that added element of, this in the environment, like we know where the flag's at, but at the same time, like enemies are going to be positioned differently than they would, team deathmatch or say a free for all.
So I guess my question, if we're going to talk about decision making in that scenario, what does that look like? For a way of thinking back on your experience, like how much thinking, goes into how you're playing the game?
Overall, I would say very little. It'd be a minimal amount of thinking. And if there was thinking, I feel like it would be more or less trying to kind of, I don't want to say overthinking, but it's basically what I'm trying to lead at is, saying, oh, this player is going to be right over here, hanging behind that door every time. So I'm not going to go over there. But, and then in the grand scheme of things, though, there's not really like a big collective, I don't want to say collective thought, but like there's not a big whole chain of thoughts that's going on when I'm playing like a game like that. It's more or less like just, okay, like here's the objective, go get the objective.
Right. And that's, to me, that's why I feel like sometimes when we talk about decision making in sport, we sometimes look at it like we're asking the wrong question, because the thinking part comes in afterwards, meaning like after something's happened. So from your experience, you begin thinking, if that makes sense. Like you start thinking like, oh, he might be behind that door, or I got to avoid this area because I got shot there last time. So the thoughts are influenced as an afterthought. So to me, like the thinking part comes in later. One of the things that I've heard David Snowden talk about is that because things happen so fast, our system has to react faster than we can think. In order to, say, for example, he used the example, like if we touch something hot, our hand will pull back faster than that thought actually reaches our brain. Because in order to not really highly burn yourself, your system has to respond much faster. And it's the cognition comes in to check to see if we were right, if that makes sense. You touch something hot, you pull it back fast, and you're like, oh, my hand's not burned, is it? And then you kind of like tap it again and get a feel to like, okay, was that the right call? And so to me, the what that says is that perception and action can happen much more quickly than thought. So that whole issue about we don't have enough time, to me, maybe is not as big of a problem as we thought, or as we're making it out to be from a mathematical standpoint, because that is one of the biggest issues that I think, at least the scientific side of the hitting world is thinking about.
So then I guess my question go back to an earlier point of, when you say something like from past experiences, I'm told not to go there, etc. Do you think there's a relationship between experience and thought time? Or do you think it could be something like a bell curve, if you will?
Well, so this is what I mean by, I believe memories and thoughts to have emergent properties. So oftentimes our thoughts are tied to certain information that we pick up in the environment. So for example, as you might not be worried about something, and then as soon as you get to a certain area, you begin to notice like the environment start to change. So for example, in your game, like you start working towards a building, and then you get into a certain area of that building, and all of a sudden you start to feel uneasy. And you don't necessarily know why until you get closer and you realize, oh, this is the place that I got shot last time, And so it's more about how the information interacts, or like in the environment, causes different thoughts to emerge. They emerge spontaneously, if that makes sense.
No, I think you bring up a great point, because it's kind of like, let's say, to kind of explain this another way / make this a little bit more clear for me. Let's say like you're driving down the road and, you're listening to music, you're having a good time, you're not really thinking, but like, you almost nearly, let's say you nearly sideswipe a car or something, on the side of the parking lot. You're not really like thinking about that, but then after that happens, you're thinking about it a little bit more. Or as it's approaching closer, you're like, okay, and then maybe the next few times you drive, you think about it as you kind of like, let's say, approach the side of the road. Because I mean, that's something that like happened to me recently, where I'm driving down the road, and there's these line of cars that are parked on the side, and I was dangerously close to one of them. Now I'm like, okay, now I see cars on the side of the road, like I need to focus more on staying a little bit further away. Now, is that like a similar kind of thought process?
Yeah, I think that's one example, right? So, for example, like players who don't perform well, like they get the yips, right? And they're totally fine in the bullpen, and then they get out on the game mound and they can't find the strike zone because of like a previous bad experience. And so it's the context of the environment that shifts their motor behavior, and not just their motor behavior, but also their emotional state. And so that's why I think we have to really think about the context and the environment and how that shapes behavior. And that's also what I mean by memories have emergent properties, that they're very much tied to specific things that will like trigger them, so to speak. And it's only under certain conditions that they will actually arise. And they don't always necessarily arise where you would always expect them to. Sometimes, because that's kind of this idea of emergence, it's the coalescing of different constraints that produce an outcome that without them present, it doesn't actually emerge. Like you can't have the same thing when you like actually pull it apart. And so that's kind of the idea of emergence, or this idea that it has an emergent property.
Got it. So now that's a little bit more clear, because now we're saying, thoughts tend to happen more if they're tied to kind of an event or events that, like you mentioned, can be traumatic, or in the case of a person, or maybe, I know, like talking with some of the Quincy players, like there's a particular field that when they play at, they're like, man, that's like, there's this just terrible mound, and the pitchers are like, this mound never makes me feel comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another kind of example in terms of those emergent properties, because it's like, well, you only think about that because, from your past experience /
well, and that's, I guess the question becomes, when we're thinking about it from a training standpoint, can we recreate that? Right. So in my opinion, in some ways, no, and I'm going the wrong direction here. I was going to say yes, but really, I think based upon what we were talking about, the answer is no from an emergent standpoint, because you can't recreate that, like that complete environment. Yes, maybe you can recreate a mound that is similar, but it's not going to have the same, backdrop. It's not going to have the same dugouts. It's not going to have the same, what's around the field and all that stuff is going to give that vibe. It's not going to have the smells, all that sort of stuff. So the question is, well, if that's true, you can't recreate that environment and that uncomfortability. Can you create a different type of uncomfortability? Can you create more types of uncomfortability so that they have a better way of figuring out how to solve that problem when they actually are in that problem? That way, let's put it on a 1 to 10 scale. Instead of it being like 8 or 9 on an uncomfortability scale, maybe we can dial that back down to like a 6 or a 7. And one would assume that performing at a 6 or a 7 of uncomfortability, you have a higher rate of success. And so really it's about trying to give yourself every incremental advantage that you can to be able to better solve that problem.
Yeah. And so that leads kind of into my question, where we're saying, okay, can we kind of track this in some way, shape, or form by saying, okay, like you mentioned, scale of 1 to 10, let's say, I asked one of the pitchers on that field, on a scale of 1 to 10, how uncomfortable were you? And let's say they said 8. Now, can we not necessarily recreate the environment, but kind of build a similar environment in a practice setting and be like, hey, how uncomfortable with you are you? And then be able to tie that to game performance and say, okay, if you're at an uncomfortability number of, 6 or 7, etc., how does your performance compare to, say, at uncomfortability levels of, 2 or 4 at the lower levels?
And I think you could definitely do this and track it. You just have to, it's the study is going to be a longer term study, right? This isn't something that you're going to be able to, collect some data for a couple of weeks and then see how it changes. You're going to have to get like multiple seasons worth of data, right? So in order to test this, you'd have to ask them that question throughout the season at various different places that they play. And then it actually might be 3 years, 4 years, right? Because you don't always necessarily, it might be, you might not go play at their place again for another 2 years or another year, because the next season you're at home, right? So this is where the only way to actually test that is to get multiple different data points, right? And hope that there's multiple opposing fields where they feel uncomfortable, and then do your training intervention of introducing uncomfortability into their training environment, and then retest next year and see what those scores are. But you're going to have some confounding factors. And that being like the more familiar you are with a situation, potentially the more prepared you're going to be for it, because you kind of know what to expect.
Right. So, yeah. And then again, this goes into kind of, part of kind of like solving baseball, if you will, in a way where, is there a relationship between how much preparation you have versus game performance? Because, logistically, let's say, going back to college, you're studying for a test. The more time you spend studying for it, the more likely you're going to do better. So the more time you prepare for certain situations, etc., game states, environments, etc., you are intuitively, we want to say you're more likely, but being able to quantify that then would be the next step of kind of solving that problem.
I'm trying to think of this quote. There's a quote that talks about when you over quantify things, like they begin to lose their meaning. And I wish I could find that quote, because I do think there's a level of, it's hard to reduce all of this down to its essence. Because it's really hard to parse out, because we have to remember that we're working with complex organisms, and as a result, just how I was explaining that, to actually quantify this, you'd have to do a longitudinal study here, and the person that you first interact with that first season, when it comes around to the second season or third season, when he gets back into that same situation, he's not the same person. Like his maturity level, experience, action capabilities, they're going to be different. And so can you necessarily just contribute that to putting him in uncomfortable training environments? And that's what I think is difficult. I mean, it's the same way that coaches intuitively understand that the more, like, say, for example, a freshman goes out and plays, the more comfortable and the better that they're going to perform their sophomore and junior or senior years. Right. So they're probably really uncomfortable and nervous their first year, but over time they get more comfortable, even though you didn't put them in really uncomfortable situations. They just matured. And so that's where it's going to be hard to really suss out whether or not it's the uncomfortability training. Like in theory, though, I want to say that, yes, that will help. Like it will help them be able to handle adversity. And I think that's actually the biggest thing. Now that to me is like one of the things that I saw this year, is that guys weren't trained to be able to handle adversity really well. And that's where, to me, having that be part of the training regimen, it doesn't need to be that way all the time, but having that in there and trying to build that up in guys, I think is really helpful to making the player more adaptable, more resilient.
I think, yeah, too, and kind of build off that. I feel like it still could be a study worth looking into. And I mean, if, yes, it's hard to quantify, but you could still kind of see that in terms of the data. Because if it is, difficult, there's still noise. There still would be noise within the data to kind of say, okay, well, this is not necessarily,
You would see some correlation, you would assume, right?
Yes.
Even if it doesn't explain all the variants, you would still see that there was some level of a correlation.
Yes. And so that kind of leads me kind of to some other points is, how do we quantify putting guys in adverse situations? So like one idea that popped in my head is, let's say you're doing an inter squad in the fall. And early on, you automatically give one of the teams like 7-8 runs. Give them a 7-8 run lead, and you just tell the other team, hey, you're down 7 or 8 runs. Like, you got to claw your way back. But then again, like, does that really solve anything?
I don't think so necessarily. I would try to do it more game-like, if that makes sense. Like, I would have a bad call in there and just see how guys respond. Like that to me would be a simple way. And I've been thinking about that in terms of like how we train players. I mean, because so often what I see is, whether it's pitching or hitting or whatever, we always try to get the call as right as possible so that the athlete feels justified, that things are fair. But the game is not fair. Like the umpires make mistakes. That's not fair. So the game itself is inherently not fair. And so we have to model that in practice. And, one thing that I remember from my own playing experience is that our coaches would tell us sometimes like, that's going to be a strike in conference once we start playing. Like, yeah, that's a ball or two off, but that's going to get called. So in some ways, to me, that is one piece of information that a hitter needs to be able to pick up on and adjust what they're doing. And they don't necessarily need to adjust what they're doing with less than 2 strikes. But once you get to 2 strikes, you should have a decent idea of what the strike zone is. So one of the other things that I think is super important here, and that, or just to kind of transition, because I know we wanted to talk about it, was narrative and the importance of narrative. Because like, it's fairly well known now, or it's something that coaches have started to recognize, that you can't just throw data at kids. Like, because just throwing out data, that people aren't necessarily convinced by data. And I was listening to some podcasts kind of explaining that is, people aren't usually actually swayed by the data. And it's really more about the narrative surrounding the data that has a greater impact on influencing people and their behavior. And so it's got me thinking more about how does that play in, to all the things that we're talking about, when we're introducing adversity and into practice, you have to craft a narrative around that as to why you're doing that, so that players really understand. It can't just be like explaining the science behind it or anything like that. Like, you have to craft a narrative and something that they're going to be able to connect with and understand the importance in a tangible way for them. And so that's something that really has stuck out to me, in that I need to start telling maybe more stories or giving examples. Because I just remember that for me, in my playing experience, whenever our coach would kind of he would always tell stories or create, Johnny High School, some sort of caricature to help us understand, like, hey, don't be that guy. This is how we need to behave, and like crafting a narrative around that. And how that stuck with you way more than some sort of facts and data. And so that's why I think it's actually really important to not just give athletes data, but also give them a story and a narrative around that so that they're actually able to connect with it and remember it.
No, you bring up a great point, because that's happened plenty of times, especially early on at Quincy. So in my experience, since I'm more like data driven, data oriented, like, show me the data, I'll understand it. But that doesn't necessarily apply for, the other guys. So I'm just like, hey, your bat speed's this. And they're like, I don't know what do you want me to do about it?
I don't know why that's relevant.
But yeah, so it's building that narrative by saying, hey, Johnny High School had this great bat speed, and here's what it allowed him to do. Balls would travel further, exit velos would be higher. Now, obviously, that's not like a perfect example, but being able to build that then helps them, putting it in a way to help them understand. Okay, hey, like this is what it means, like. And that's why,
and this is why it's important.
Yeah, because, if you, on September 1st, 2020, the Quincy University baseball program knew very little about spin rate and, why it matters. On May 31st, 2021, all of our pitching staff understand spin rate and how it's impactful to how they pitch in the zone. Because you put the narrative behind it by saying, so I would say, hey, with this spin rate, you can throw further up in the zone. So, and then being able to maybe test it out. So I would do something like overlay videos for our players and put that narrative behind it by saying, hey, if you throw your fastball up, you can throw your curveball down, and here's the video. Showing you, that narrative. Hey, you made this guy look silly by throwing fastballs up, curveballs down, and here's video kind of. And again, this is my side of being able to have data and or video to back it up. But then being able to have that narrative side.
So essentially, you gave them a story, for example, hey, for example, this player that I worked with, this is how he saw success with similar spin rate, and this is how he used it to be successful, how he transformed himself. I think because those are the stories that are most compelling. Hey, he turned his career around by doing X, Y, and Z, and this was the secret to how he was able to turn his career around. And so you can find that same success if you follow these same steps, or if you buy into this process.
Yeah, and I mean I can think of a specific example. We had one pitcher who was, by the end of the COVID 2020 season, he was 83, 85. He threw a lot of two-seam fastballs. But once I collected data on him, once, the coaching staff kind of talked about it, we had, some pitch design data too. We were like, let's just try four-seam fastballs. Tried four-seam fastballs, and he's got one of the highest spin curveballs in all of baseball. It's over 3,000 RPMs. He can throw it, and then we're like, you know what? Just try throwing it up in the zone. So given his spin rate on his fastball and then his curveball, not only that, but being able to try that out and say, hey, just, for this inter squad, just try throwing fastballs up. He threw 7 fastballs up in that inter squad. He got 5 swing and misses. And so he's like, okay, now let's try this. By the end of the season, he was throwing 90, 92.
That's crazy. That's an awesome story right there.
Yeah. So it's
that's what dreams are made of.
Being able to, being able to do that. Or, we have another guy, again, two-seam guy that would, throw down in the zone. A lot of our philosophy was, throw two seams in, kind of get on the hands. But then we're like, again, another guy that he had a high spin rate once on those balls where either he cut it or, he didn't have the proper tilt or spin axis to have a two-seam fastball, but it ended up turning into a four-seam. And we found that out, and boy, he led the nation in Ks per nine at 17.3 by the end of the season, going from two-seam to four seams mostly. And then that again, and then he's like, okay, so then should I throw more four seams up? And again, that was a specific example. I show him a video overlay of his last start throwing a couple fastballs up, and he's like, man, I let that fastball get away from me. But because it played so well with his curveball, being able to see that, and he's like, wow, I should actually be doing that. And here we are. And again, 17.3 Ks per nine. That's nothing to scoff at.
It just, as you were describing that, it just helped me understand, like, you should probably in the fall have guys throw everything, and just collect data on it and just see, like, hey, this is how I've always done things. Okay, that's cool. Try this. Like, because we don't know. Maybe you have something like really, really freaking good sitting on the shelf that you didn't even know about. Or I guess a better analogy is you might have buried treasure hidden in your backyard or something, and if we kind of go digging around, like, we might actually find like a diamond in the rough here, and we can actually improve your repertoire and improve how we go about things. I mean, sometimes too, like, it can just give you information on how to better utilize what you already have. Like, you might realize, oh, I can actually lean on my fastball actually more than I am, or I'm actually leaning too heavily on my fastball, and my breaking ball is really elite and I don't throw it enough. I need to throw it more.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I just see, like, the fall as being a great time to just have guys throw a bunch of different stuff and just see what the movement profiles are and the spin rates, and collect all that data and then go from there.
I mean, it's a great time to be able to do that. And that's kind of where, you get those ideas. Because, originally I'm like, okay, like, I kind of use the fall as like, okay, let's just figure out what they have. And then once I started collecting more data, once the numbers started to normalize a little bit in terms of, data quality / data inconsistency. Once those numbers started to normalize, I'm like, okay, so given this, why is he throwing it this way instead of, this way? And then branching off of there and being able to say, okay, given his repertoire, like, here's what we can do to best optimize it for that particular pitcher.
Oh yeah. I think that's a good closing spot. Any other updates, things you want to share with folks?
Oh, I can't wait to be dropping some more fire research, because someone me is currently employed as a summer intern at Driveline, so
Ooh.
Hopefully be able to build on some of that stuff.
So are we hearing that first here?
You heard it here first.
Awesome. Well, I don't got anything else. I think that was a good run. Yeah. If you enjoyed the show, follow us on Twitter. You can follow Robert at Robert Fry 40, right? No spaces or
at
spaces?
Robert Fry 40, no spaces, and it's FREY. Don't spell it FRYE, because you ain't going to get no results.
And you can find me at GBOYUM01 on the Twitterverse.
That's also my contact name for him in my phone. So there you go.
All right. Till next time.
Till next time.